we have no further announcements, we'll want to introduce Jeremy Perez, who's going to give us, I'm sure, quite a good presentation on night sky photography. I'll get the lights out.
Are you the one that brought the clouds?
See, I haven't picked up any new equipment recently, but it's always possible. I was thinking of new equipment, so thank you for having me. A little bit about myself. I got involved in amateur astronomy about 15 years ago, and was involved with visual observing at the time. So my interest was sketching. I picked the bug up from Bill Perez, who was the president of the club at the time, and he encouraged sketching as a way of seeing things and really getting a deep understanding of objects and appreciating them for what they are. And that's what I did for a number of years. But throughout my life, I've had an interest in photography as well. And so when I first took on the goal of seeing things in the night sky, I thought about photography, but it was just too difficult to even contemplate trying to capture things and enjoy myself at the same time. There was just such a steep learning curve, it appeared to be. And so I kind of put that off for a period of time and really went for the visual side. So since then, I've kind of been picking up ideas and ways of approaching astrophotography. Instead of going with the telescope option, I'm going more for the wide-angle tripod shots of the night sky. But I've been running around, probably like you guys. I've crossed paths with you. I imagine if anybody was out in the Nebraska Panhandle, we might have crossed paths a couple of years ago with the eclipse, the Great American Eclipse. Looking forward to the next one coming up in a few years. So hopefully we'll see each other out somewhere else out on the plains and maybe a little bit further south. But speaking of the plains, one of the things I like to do, I go out and I photograph storms. So that's kind of another little thing that I've been enjoying doing, just trying to capture the sky again, but in the daytime under inclement weather out on the plains, or else coming back here home to Arizona and some of the unique things we get to experience out here too. So just taking the camera around and seeing the crazy things we've got.
Jeremy, would you describe that, please?
This right here is that's a landspout tornado we had out by Marion Crater earlier this year, back in October. Just a very difficult thing to anticipate, predict, but we're just kind of keeping an eye out for storms that could produce something interesting, and this one did. We get a lot more, I think, of these out here than we realize, but we're so sparsely populated we don't often see
Do you
them.
have good life insurance?
I do, actually. But I steer clear, so I keep this thing's about 5 miles away. Definitely keep the distance from those crazy things. But the more peaceful side is getting back out and wandering around up here in northern Arizona and other places to see what the night sky has to offer and the different kinds of landscapes that we have. And so I've been practicing that and trying to capture the unique ways that our environment joins the sky and just getting different compositions that reflect that. So again, speaking of running across each other, anybody recognize that telescope there? But so we got Brent Arkinol out to the Star Party a couple of years ago. Go out there and I'll get some shots from time to time. But we live in a great place to be able to do that, for sure. So what I want to cover with you tonight is I'm not going to put a lot of emphasis or spend a lot of time on the gear, software, and resources. I do want to cover some highlights here. Also some ethics and sensibilities, but I really want to focus on the art of sky and foreground, and then give a kind of a case example with Marion Crater. So on the gear side of things, so one of the kind of the key here, there's two important pieces, and one of them is a sturdy tripod. Obviously use whatever you have, but the sturdier the better. It's going to simplify issues that you might face with cameras jostling around, the wind moving things, and vibration and all of that. And some accessories. I just wanted to mention this one just because it's a pretty affordable thing. It's probably about 20 or 30 bucks. It's called a super clamp. And this thing will attach to tripod legs or whatever. It's just got a little grip right there that you tighten up, and it can help you get some low angles. Some tripods are built to go low, but most aren't, and it's kind of tough. So you can use that thing to get it down on a leg, get down low, so that you can pop some of the foreground elements up above the horizon and kind of create some interest with the sky. So I just wanted to mention that as something to consider. But So the next big thing, of course, is the camera. And to be able to capture the night sky, we need a camera that has some ability to tweak with it, to make some manual adjustments. So being able to set your camera to a manual setting where you can lengthen your exposure time and adjust the ISO, that's the sensitivity of the sensor, and to also be able to adjust the aperture of the lens to meet some of the unique needs of our night photography shots. And you may have some other lenses just kind of switching in and out, but if you have wide-angle lenses, the wider the better, at least for getting started, but it allows you to get more light into the camera for a longer period of time without noticing star trails. But there's creative options. People use telephoto photography also, just have to adapt to some unique needs there if you're shooting a lot tighter zoom on things with the sky moving. So another piece is the intervalometer. So again, these are fairly affordable, maybe $15 to $25 on Amazon, and that'll allow you to get your shots without having to touch the camera. At the same time, you can also set it for time lapse to run ongoing exposures and create a time lapse of the sky in motion, or capturing meteor activity. That way you can keep going and going and going, and hopefully you catch some meteors along the way. And then if you are, this is kind of one of those optional things. There's a lot of ways to capture your foreground in a shot. One of the things I like to do, though, is to do light painting. So you can get a spotlight, maybe get a colored gel for the cover of it. And when I first started doing this, I had a brown Safeway paper bag, plastic bag, and I just rubber band that around the head of the light to give it a warm color. So that kind of warms it up. These lights typically by themselves have a very cool light, and that kind of clashes with some of the scenes you might be trying to illuminate. But again, that's not the only way to approach that, but it's one of the options you can have for nightscape photography. And then, of course, you got to have the batteries, and it helps to have quite a few of them in backup, and so just it's kind of one of those things where you can kind of pick those up over time gradually, and they just become a really good safety net, because it's frustrating to be out in a very dark place, far away from everything else, and have your batteries close to dying out. And then all of the comforts that you'll want, warm weather gear, some place to hang, sit down and warm up. So all the usual observing or photography pieces to go along with that. But really, the keys are the tripod, and I can actually walk up to this thing without a shadow on it, the tripod and the camera, so with the lens. So one other thing I wanted to mention, so I was talking about the tripod. Something else you can do is shoot track photography. So if you've got an equatorial mount or a sky tracker, a lot of times those are built for just getting a wide angle shot of the sky. But there's some things you can do that can make that applicable to landscape and sky together in a shot for a nightscape. And I'll show an example of that in just a little bit. So that's another option. So technical details. When you're shooting, usually when you're shooting with a camera, you want to get that ISO down, because the sensitivity, so this is a low sensitivity at 100, high sensitivity at 3200. That lower sensitivity of the also is less noisy. So if you're shooting landscapes during the day, you'll usually use that a little bit lower to get less noise. But at night, we're lacking a lot of light. We need to capture more of it, and you can try to, well, maybe I'll shoot this at 800, because that's less noise, and I'll just crank up the exposure later when I'm processing. But the problems you run into if you kind of use a lower ISO when shooting is that your camera is still generating noise, electronic noise, and there's a certain threshold that noise kind of builds up, and if your ISO is too low, later on when you're processing, you have to bring your exposure up. At the same time, you're going to be raising that electronic noise up, and it puts all kinds of ugly things into your image, banding and weird artifacts. And so by shooting really high exposure or ISO to begin with, you don't have to bring that exposure up. You are going to have more noise in the image, but it won't be the kind of distracting noise that you would have if you're trying to bring that other stuff up and bringing kind of stripes and weird stuff into your image. So try to shoot a little bit higher. Of course, there's always experimentation. Each camera is different. each situation is. So it kind of takes a little bit of getting used to also, but it's kind of a good starting point is to start a little bit higher there. So exposure length, if you're shooting, trying to shoot the sky with stars that are pinpoints or as close to pinpoints as possible, you have to balance the need for a longer exposure to get more light in, but also keeping it short enough that you don't start seeing streaks in those stars. And so there used to be a thing called the 500 rule, which you'd say, take the number 500 and divide that by the focal length of your lens, and that's about the number of seconds you can get away with. But as cameras have gotten better sensors and higher definition in those sensors, that number doesn't seem to be applicable anymore. And some people say you should use the 200 rule. And so, like, for example, if I've got a 16 millimeter lens, I divide 200 by 16, and so it's saying that 12 and a half seconds is about what I could expect to get away with before I start seeing trailing. And I think really though it's more than just that. It's hard to boil it down to a simple rule, because if you're photographing towards the equator versus photographing towards the pole, the amount of distance the sky is covering over a period of time is different. And then also your camera, how much detail that sensor is able to pick up, how fine of a resolution it has is going to make an impact. And then also how big you intend to print it. So if you're just going to show it on Instagram or Facebook or something, you can get away with a lot longer, because you're not going to have the kind of resolution that's going to show those sort of streaks and trails. But if you're going to be printing it up big poster size, then that's when you really have to be thinking about those possibilities. So really, it's just the longest you can get away with, and that amounts to maybe a little bit of testing. And when you're out there studying up your shot, make an exposure, 15, 30 seconds, zoom in after it's done exposing, and look at that preview and see, what kind of trailing are you getting, and are you willing to put up with that? And then that'll kind of help you to gauge that. The next thing is aperture. So when we're shooting, we're usually going to be trying to open that lens as wide as we can so that we can capture as much light. Now that'll expose the imperfections of your lens, unfortunately, but really, all in all, the wider the better, just because of the impact that brighter exposure is going to have on your image is going to be impressive. And so a lot of lenses that come kit with cameras will go open up to f3.5, and that's how I started. It presents a challenge because that kind of an opening compared to a wider, say an f2 opening versus an f3.5, it makes a big difference in the light gathering ability. So you'll have to fuss with things more if it won't open as wide. But if you get to a point where you can add a lens maybe to your repertoire and you can get something that opens up to say f2 or even wider, it's worth giving it a shot. But whatever the lens you have, try to open it up as wide as possible when you're first starting getting those shots. There's a big old Gumby looking chart here, so I'm going to point out a couple things about it. But when we come to focus, this is a very challenging part of getting Nightscape images, and one of the ways to do that is through live view, which is on the back of your camera. If the camera supports live view, you'll press a button, you'll be able to see live what the camera is picking up. And so you'll look for a bright star, Sirius, or maybe look for planets, Saturn, Jupiter, or whatever, and get your focus set to infinity if you want. Now that's a quick way to do it, but there's two things to think about. One is your camera may not have live view, and if that's the case, like my first camera was, you're doing a lot of iterations. You're shooting, adjusting focus, shooting again, adjusting focus. It's really tedious. So a way to get around that is to shoot what's called a hyperfocal distance, which is your camera will focus at a very specific point, but when you're focused there, it'll actually have a range of depth where it'll appear reasonably in focus. And that's called depth of field, and what you can do is use that to your advantage. Instead of focusing on infinity, because if you focus on infinity, you'll get infinity in focus, plus a certain distance back towards you in focus, but it'll be way out there. If, on the other hand, you focus what's called hyperfocal, this is a distance where you can focus somewhere, and once you focus at that point, you'll get infinity in focus, you'll get your hyperfocal distance in focus, and you'll get a certain distance closer to you. And what that does is it brings that depth of field closer to you. So you've got infinity back here, and you've got the closer range here, so that you've got a greater amount of that image in focus. And what that's going to help you do is add more of your foreground into sharpness. So that's a tough part with Nightscape photography, is getting a sharp foreground with a sharp star field. So to figure that hyperfocal distance out, you can find charts online or take a little chart with you or something but there's an app I'm going to show in just a second that kind of helps ease that situation up a little bit. It looks at what the focal length of your lens is. It looks at how wide you're going to open that lens. It also looks at what your camera is, so it knows how high of a resolution your sensor is. And then from there, it'll give you a number. And in this case, for this combination, it's saying 6 3/4 meters is hyperfocal distance. So maybe to be safe, I'd nudge that out to 7 or 8 meters out, and you focus there, and you'll get your star field. And then also you'll get close to you, maybe about 4 meters away would also be in focus. So that's not too bad, about 12 feet off-ish, kind of. And so when that happens, what you can do is get out there and instead of focusing on the star field, you can measure off or walk off 7 meters to something, get your camera aimed at it, and then light it up for just a bit, get your focus set on that object, and now your camera is set at that hyperfocal distance. Now you can plant it wherever you want for capturing a composition that you're after. So another thing, a lot of cameras will have a noise reduction feature on them, and if you're kind of taking it easy, getting those shots at a leisurely pace, you can turn this on, and it might save you some processing time later on. It kind of depends on how you like to process your images, but it'll go in, and when your camera's shooting for long periods of time, you'll get sensor noise in there. Not just kind of random stuff, but like, red pixels, green, all these hot pixels and other stuff. And this will, after you shoot your main exposure, this will automatically then shoot a second exposure that it will subtract out of that and at least eliminate those issues from your images. But you can't really use this if you're really going fast. If you're shooting a time lapse that you need to keep those images rolling, this will interfere with your with the fluidness of that time lapse. Same thing with meteors. You'll be losing half of your meteor time to a processing action that won't capture anything. So you want to turn it off in those situations, which leads to something I'm not even going to get into, but dark framed and flat framed. If you're an astrophotographer in here, that's an additional process that you may be familiar with to manually shoot images to subtract noise, to get a nice even illumination on your field. I don't do that. The processing is already pretty ornery for my sensibilities, so I don't go down this road, but that's an option. So on the software side, I was talking about one of these apps that's pretty helpful. So I've been using for a while one called Planet, and then recently became aware of another one called Photopills that I like even more. But what these do is these are apps for your phone that will allow you to look up on a map some location, and it'll plot out for you the rise and set points for the sun, the moon. It'll plot out, where the Milky Way core is going to be, and you can see relative to your position in the landscape where all of that stuff's going to happen. So if you want the sun to rise over a feature or the moon to set over something, or you're going to capture the core of the Milky Way over whatever, you can use this to kind of get an idea where you want to be. And I'm going to show an application of that in just a bit. But it's super useful. And this app right here, this Photopills, also has a lot of other functions in it, like that hyperfocal distance. You can plug in your camera info and just have that number ready for you. And I'm not a sponsor for these guys. There's I think they cost about $10 for that one. I don't know what this is, but it's kind of worth it if you really want to get into it, just for the detail it can bring you. So another thing in terms of actually processing and taking care of your images is you've got to store them somewhere, getting them onto your hard drive or a backup. There's different tools you can use to catalog them. I use Lightroom because it has some added features. Not only will it catalog your images, and you can add tags to them so you can find them easier, but it also allows you to do a lot of pretty decent amount of processing to them also. So there's other tools out there, and I'm not trying to promote one over the other. It's just something to be considering. But then also, Lightroom can only go so far. A lot of these cataloging programs can only go so far. So that's when we get into Photoshop. So, and there are some analogies to Photoshop out there. I think GIMP is one, and some others. But some tool that's going to allow you to do more detailed editing to your images, because a lot of times you need to to process different parts of the image differently. You may need some masking to be involved. You may need to adjust color and tone. And all of this stuff, you don't have to get totally deep and ground into it right off the bat, but knowing that you have the ability to gradually make more tweaks if you need to is really helpful in those programs, and especially if you are layering multiple things on top of each other to get an effect that you think is important. And then another program that I use is called PTGUI, called PTGUI. There's other programs that will do what this one does, but what it allows you to do is a couple things. It'll allow you to create panoramas. Now, a lot of software will auto-generate panoramas. So you take different shots of the sky, it'll compose them into one. But I've found that a lot of times they struggle to resolve star fields and get the stars to line up properly, or it'll reject it outright. What this program does is it allows you to manually control that process. So instead of maybe doing a panorama here, I'm doing stacking. I want to layer maybe 3 or 4 shots of that star field together to reduce noise. And this will allow me to pick specific stars across the field. And this is kind of the pattern I'll use, maybe 8 different plot points in there, just to make sure it captures the geometry and it'll lay it all flat on top of each other. Because what happens is if you are shooting multiple images of a star field with a wide lens, as that sky is turning on you, the geometry of that star field is changing. And it's really weird. So you'll take your 3 shots into Photoshop and like, okay, I'm just going to rotate these back together and stack them. And all of a sudden, what lines up down here doesn't line up in other weird places just because that lens geometry is weird. So this program sees where you've plotted these, and it readjusts all that geometry for you. And it'll export that to Photoshop, and you have a layered file. There's a few other options out there to do the same thing, but just know that that can sometimes be helpful for some of those projects. And so resources to kind of look for, I just put a few down here. The internet obviously is loaded with advice. There's one, clarkvision.com/articles/nightscapes, that has a lot of detail, a lot of numbers, so if you really want to dig into the numbers and the details, you can go there. But The World at Night, twanight.org, is also a good place for inspiration on nightscapes. And of course, Sky and Telescope Astronomy, the astronomy publications will feature articles on the same thing. And something I'd encourage, I've been really impressed by this, is on YouTube. There's a user on YouTube that the site is called Nightscape Images. His page there has a lot of great step-by-step for both capturing and processing nightscape images. Really beautifully done and easy to follow, enjoyable to watch. So if you want to kind of get into that some more, there's a lot of detail to be had there. So ethic and sensibilities of stacking and compositing. So the reason I wanted to add this in here is because a lot of times in the photography world, if you are not capturing your image in a single shot, and that's it, there can be concern. People can feel very frustrated by the idea that your image has been captured from multiple exposures. And so I wanted to talk just a little bit about that with nightscape photography, because it is possible to capture nightscape images in one shot and use those, but there are a lot of challenges that go with it. And so one of those is sensor noise and dealing with wide angles. So depending on the camera you shoot with, you'll have different levels of noise to deal with. Full frame sensor cameras have a lot less noise to deal with. Crop sensor cameras will have more. And you're working with what you've got. So if you shoot an image that a single exposure, maybe it's 20 seconds of your star field, and you have all this noise in here, and you can edit that to a degree and add contrast, darken it, or brighten certain, brighten the brights, darken the darks, get some contrast in there. But that noise is going to want to jump out at you as you do more work on it. But one of the things you can do, as I was talking about earlier, is stacking images, where you take maybe 4 to 8 shots of the same exposure over and over, and then when you realign that star field and you layer those together in Photoshop, you can apply them in a way that they capture all the signal, which is the stars and the sky, and they average out all the random noise. And so you get a much smoother star field, and then when you go to contrast, do color work on it, it's a lot more cooperative. And so that's one of the reasons why I will shoot multiple exposures to generate one single image, is to do that stacking. And then wide angles is another reason. If you're trying to capture the Milky Way with the zodiacal light, you have to get that really wide field, and maybe the widest lens you have isn't going to be big enough to really capture that impression. So you might shoot, 4 to 9 images in a grid of that area, and then have those be composited back together to form a single image panorama. And so that might be another situation where you take multiple shots to capture one image. Another option is dealing with incorporating some light to it. So if you're doing light painting, so you might be, for an image like this, maybe you're shooting 3 or 4 images of the sky to get a stacking option up there, but maybe at the same time you're shooting those images, you're running around with that light and kind of lighting up different things, and afterwards you might find some of those have good elements that you can blend together from that same image to create a full composite final image. So you might generate multiple originals to create the single final, which leads me to everybody's going to have personal sensibilities about this. And so the personal boundaries I have around capturing those images is it needs to happen from a single spot, and it needs to happen during a single session. As in, I personally will not shoot one shot of a landscape here and then go off to another site and shoot a better Milky Way because it's got a better location, and then blend them and then act like I caught that into one spot. That'll pass a certain boundary for me where I don't feel that that's a proper representation. Now, if I do something out of the ordinary with that, then I'll try to give details about what happened, because I don't want anybody to be misled about what's taking place in the image. So it's just something to think about. Everybody needs to kind of process that their own way and think about how they approach it. But just to know that in Nightscape photography, there's a lot of times where people will be shooting multiple images at first to be able to blend into a final afterward. And in tripod or tracking, so I was mentioning the idea of using an equatorial mount earlier to get deeper images. So that, I was wanting to head out and get Wertanen a few months ago when it was cruising between the Pleiades and the Hyades. And so I brought my equatorial mount, set the camera on top, and ran some exposures of that, longer exposures than I could get on the tripod, of course, but because it's tracking. So the other thing I wanted to do was I knew that this was going to be setting, in the west, and I thought it would be pretty cool to get this setting behind the peaks or some other feature. And so I went out and scouted a location and thought, yeah, this will be great. It'll set behind the San Francisco peaks. I can get a shot of this all happening and going behind the mountain. And so what I did is I went out, and so I'm shooting a track shot in this shot. So we've got a still, the stars are sharp here, but the landscape is blurred, of course, because it's tracking with the sky, a nice long exposure. So then once it reached a point that I had decided I wanted it to get to, it lowered down to this point, then I turned off tracking. And then I shot same exposure length, same settings on the camera, but now I'm shooting still of the ground and letting the sky just twirl away behind. So I've got the benefit of having same exposure sky, same exposure foreground, and now I can open those up and layer them and mask them to get to an image where I've got both sky and foreground, and I've got a deeper sky than I would have had before. So I've got a crop sensor camera, by the way, and so it's more challenging for my camera to capture deeper images quickly. But what I loved about it was, I got the California Nebula in there. I thought, okay, that's cool. But then I ran into this unexpected issue, which is when I was scouting this, it was in daylight, and I hadn't anticipated how much of an impact Flagstaff was going to have on that image. And so I lost all of the contrast I was hoping for there. I mean, I got maybe some cool air glow, or I don't know, going on back there. But anyway, so there's kind of these little unexpected issues you deal with. But that's kind of what the thought process I might go through for something like that. So now when we get into the idea of crafting the sky and foreground together, there's somebody else we know in this room. So sky targets, thinking about what in the sky can we capture, because really the first thing a lot of times you're going to see in a Nightscape shot is the core of the Milky Way. That's like the primo sky target that people are after, is getting the Sagittarius, Scorpius area of the Milky Way, and having that amid some foreground element. And it is awesome, and definitely it's one of the things I shoot the most. But at the same time, when we talk about, sometimes if you subscribe to certain social media feeds on Instagram or Twitter, you'll see people talking about, it's Milky Way season again, you know, they're getting ready, getting their gear all primed and everything. But it doesn't have to be about the core of the Milky Way. The Cygnus and other parts of the Winter Milky Way, Perseus and Cassiopeia, they all provide really interesting parts, if you're going for the Milky Way, things to shoot. And it doesn't have to be that brilliant, crazy core. It can be other parts of it, and the bright stars in Auriga and Taurus. All of that is just wonderful to shoot. You know, get a little thin haze of Sirius over there, and all of a sudden you've got glowing lights going on with Orion and Gemini. So it's thinking about in the sky other things besides the core of the Milky Way. So I was mentioning earlier, another thing we can look for is the zodiacal light. So if the zodiacal light is lying over top of some visual target we want to capture and ruining that option, just maybe we can take that opportunity to shoot a wide image of it in contrast with the Milky Way or by itself. Or another thing I've grown to be interested in is air glow. So there was a period of time when I was trying to get air glow out of my shots. Because why is my sky green here? Oh, there's air glow. You know, why is it pink? But maybe just try to own it instead. Let those pinks and greens ripple in there and add some interest to the sky in the shot. So there's another thing to look for. And it's kind of fun to get out to a site and visually to see maybe some brightening along the horizon and think, I wonder if that's air glow over there. Let's start, you know, maybe we can get that into a shot. So it's kind of it's a mystery until you start exposing. Another possibility too is the lunar eclipses. So in addition to maybe shooting tight on it, look for an option to get either the sequence of the moon or one segment of the moon in alignment with something else that's going on in the foreground. And so in this one, so we got San Francisco peaks over here, structure out at 2 guns. The moon is setting here. So this involved a little bit of scouting too, kind of using that planet app to see where's the moon going to set tonight. Where can I set my camera up to where it will approach the peaks, and where would I need to be so it doesn't get hidden behind a structure. So some of that planning can go in ahead of time, and then you can go out and set up when the moon's still up there and just watch it drift on down as you're getting exposure after exposure to merge together into a final shot. And of course, meteor showers. So lots of dark sky around here to get out and get those meteor showers in a beautiful dark sky. And whether you're going after, can I get a fireball tonight, and would that be awesome? Or let's just sprinkle all of them in there and make so you know, this is where you get all those shots together and realign the meteors to the star field, find the stars near them, and make sure that they line up so that you could get maybe an idea of where that radiant is coming from. There's other ways to merge that together, but it needs to be same spot, same night.
A couple of oddball ones in there.
Yeah, I caught some sporadics. So I leave those in there. I figured they need some stage time too. And then satellites. So the iridiums are going away, but I think there's still a few of them out there, so it might be worth kind of trying to catch them while they're still around. Iridium flares or the International Space Station. So like this was one night at the Star Party, kind of taking a look at Heavens Above website and seeing that the ISS was going to be shooting up out of the southwest, and so I was running a time lapse and thought, well, I'll set the time lapse up where that'll shoot up in the middle of it, and so it cooperated, of course, and went where it was supposed to. And then maybe during our monsoon season, catching some of those thunderstorms with the night sky over them. This isn't one of ours. This is out in the plains, but the same idea, getting some of that natural lightning effect to go in there with it.
So in the last exposure was the light from lightning?
Oh, you're thinking about this, whatever's going on here.
The cloud deck.
So this is all lightning up here. So there's just lightning all over in this supercell cloud mass just going. Those things are like almost constant lightning. And then there's some cars that are cruising around this corner over here, kind of doing weird stuff there. Yeah, there was fireflies in a few of these, which would be kind of cool if we had those out here. And then rocket launches. So, Vandenberg has that mailing list where they'll let you know when they're about to shoot stuff off. And if it happens to happen in that great time after sundown from our location, we get that twilight effect. That's fun. This was a recent one where the clouds moved in and kind of made a wreck of trying to find a good spot for it, but it was still interesting to watch as it lifted off and shot off to the south. And then foregrounds. So all these different ways of capturing the sky. We also want to be thinking about what kind of foreground options, and it's just really just about anything can be interesting, depending on how you compose it. And being in Flagstaff, we've got all this interesting structure around here, stonework and whatever, that we can also put hints of the Milky Way even when we're in the middle of town. And so it doesn't have to be, way miles out somewhere. You can capture interesting things around here too. And heading out to the star party and everybody's got what's going on with the blue light, but that can also add some interest and give you something to play with also. They had that froth truck up, which was pretty cool. They had that magenta deep red lighting inside of it, so it was pretty interesting. The clouds were totally annoying, but they were cruising really fast, so it kind of creates this dynamic effect, and you don't have to have that perfect sky every time. And sometimes it can just provide an interesting composition with everything gathered together. And on that light pollution situation, even if we're up on top of Mount Eldon on a smoky night when there's fires burning and it's collecting all this light and amplifying it, we can still get the Milky Way to squeak out of that somehow. So it's awesome, and there's just lots of opportunities to try and maybe get something of interest there to see what that combination looks like. And it can also, if you've got to deal with it, maybe you can make it part of the composition, so it might help illuminate some clouds and add some interest to the sky or some color. And I'm not saying, I think it can either make you sick or make you interested, I don't know, but it is city lights. But they get up there on Eldon, and all of a sudden now the light source is coming up from below, which was pretty wild, just to see the way it sort of added all that dimension to the rocks and the trees up there. And again, getting out away from town, you get that color, that orange light from the LP, which is like, all right, they're not totally switching over to white, and we still got that orange sodium vapor and the orange LEDs, but get that with some of the natural moon light pollution, illuminating the landscapes, and some motion in the clouds can also be an interesting way to adapt to that. So off of light pollution from a cityscape, back to some foreground ideas. Some other things we can do is look for foreground elements that maybe add just an abstract element. And if we use a little bit of that light painting, sometimes you can kind of point that at the ground and it'll just reflect back up very softly on something to very softly illuminate it. Or you might have a project, maybe you want to capture some of the observatory domes in an area. And that was one of the things I had been working on as I was trying to get night shots of the different domes. And this is right out the door, one of those, I think right there. And I can't remember the name of that dome, but just so much to capture around here for those. Or wildflower season, head out there and get those when they're crazy. And of course the desert's going nuts right now, and we'll surely get our burst. Or any structures that can combine with the star field. Oops, I'm going to back up just a sec here. So this is one of those opportunities you take. So going out vacation with the family, going to some kind of weird little cabins, and why not just head out and see what the sky looks like over these? And so just take opportunities to maybe see what could be interesting. Or the old stars in the puddle trick. Does anybody recognize this spot? Kind of weird at night. I think that tree might have almost given away. So this is out at Anderson Mesa, that little gravel turnaround that sometimes gets muddy. So I think, actually the Nero Dome, I think, right there. And then of course Phoenix in the background, but kind of silhouettes those trees just a bit. So foreground capturing options. So this is, how do you get that foreground to be a part of your image? And one of them is by using it as a silhouette. Just find an interesting combination of trees, rocks, landscape, structures, whatever, to let the sky rest on that, and then that can provide a framework for the image. It doesn't need anything else beyond that. And then another possibility is just go the opposite direction and get the full moon in there. And if you're at a nice high altitude and have clear air, you can still get a really awesome star field, even with that moonlight just blasting at the landscape. So you can get unique effects from our kind of sometimes annoying moon. And then get the moon when it's young, maybe 3 or 4 days old, nice crescent setting in the west, and let it softly illuminate the landscape. So this is something, then you can get a lot more depth in the sky because it's not so overpowered. You can get some more Milky Way and a lot finer star field, and then also get your landscape illuminated. And if you're up here and you get that snowfall, think about it. Right after that fresh snowfall, you're going to have a day or two when it's clear. And does that happen to coincide with that young moon? That's an awesome time to get out and try to capture the landscape with it. And this is a different scenario. In this one, we're using Starlight to illuminate the foreground. So this is 2 very different lengths of exposures, maybe a 20-second exposure for the sky, and then more like a 4-minute exposure for the foreground. And what that results in, you've got 2 shots with maybe the sky has a similar illumination to the foreground when you compare them, but the sky for this, when this foreground is not composited, when you just see the original, the sky is super bright. And so you have to, when you're compositing images like that together, you have to be very careful in masking them. And I've got an example in just a few more slides to show that, because you don't want it to look too unnatural, which can easily happen. But sometimes it's fun to experiment with that, knowing that this is all Milky Way and stars are what are illuminating that foreground. And then the last thing I was mentioning earlier is light painting. So getting illumination softly on the landscape to work in partnership with the sky. So on that topic, so this was the slide I had at the beginning. This has 3 light sources in it. So I've got that light I'm shining or reflecting onto the structure. There's also another inside here adding some illumination inside the building. And then good old I-40 is putting a beam of light across this thing, which was really an interesting thing to deal with because I wanted to get a shot of this building by itself, and I realized every exposure there's this line of dark running right across it is because all the headlights are perfectly aimed at that building from I-40. So what I did was I just shot multiple exposures of it. I was playing around with some lights inside, seeing what I could light up in there, and then all of a sudden I got this one where some miracle happened, and there wasn't traffic for that 15 or 20-second shot, and so I didn't have all of that hard line running across it. So blending those together at the end, I got the lights inside I wanted, the structure of the Milky Way composed together to get that
Go back one.
funny little building.
What's that alien craft in the
Yeah, yes.
It's a zipper.
Good old, I don't know, that's probably heading off to San Diego there. I don't know, yeah, those planes. That's always fun to deal with those. It's like, it's kind of nice the later the night gets, the less there, but they never go away completely. So Marion Crater, this is the example I wanted to share. So Merriam Crater is this volcanic example of perfect conical shape. And every time I drive down Loop Road, I'm just so impressed by this cinder cone. And I've always wanted to try and do something with it. So last weekend, as I was realizing I didn't have some images I wanted to share, some examples I wanted to share with you, I realized I got to get out here and shoot this thing. So I went out and looked at, got my planetarium software, saw where the Milky Way was going to be rising within about an hour. I had about an hour between moonset and twilight. So that's where it was going to be. And so planning phase is I pulled up this map and I'm looking at it and I'm realizing, okay, the core of the Milky Way is going to be around here, which means I need to be somewhere up here on one of those roads if I want the Milky Way kind of off to the side of Merriam Crater. So that's my general idea, and instead of stumbling around there at night, I headed out the afternoon before and took a drive down those roads to see where I was going to go. And as you're driving out there, you're like, oh man, that's pretty bland. You know, it's just this one flat horizon. There's the volcanoes barely visible there, but there's some hints. There's like some lava rocks up here. Like, okay, maybe up on the top of that ridge, there's something interesting. So this is where you go ahead and just step out of the car and think, okay, how far would I need to walk at night to make this work? So got up to the top of the hill, and wow, just this landscape there was so cool. Just these crags of lava popping up in different places, and comboed with the cinder cone and everything. It's like this. I think this is the one that I want to try for. So I got out that app, that Photopills app, and it has this cool night augmented reality feature where you can move it around, and it'll show you where the sun and the moon would be at a certain time. And sure enough, the Milky Way should be right around that area, and so that's kind of what I'm thinking. That's roughly the composition I want to get. So having that in mind, I looked around. Where's the gopher holes? Where's the ant hills? You know, kind of thinking about all this stuff that's going to get you at night. And then I headed back and got to bed early. So I got out there about. I wanted to be there about an hour before moonset, just so I could be ready to set everything up, get focus in, and so. Got out there, the moon's still up, Milky Way showing, but of course it's still very blown out. The moon is getting closer to full. But I'm getting my focus set up, my composition set up. I'm like, I'd like to get a shot, you know, maybe I'll compose one where I've got the moonlight and this faint Milky Way. But then I'm like, oh no. And realizing my stupid tripod's in there. So it's like, okay, so kind of like, and you think of ways to cope with these situations. It's like, okay, I can move way off to the left here, but the moon was setting so fast that the tripod kept nudging back to the right. It was messing up my composition, so I just waited a little bit longer, and as the moon went down, I got myself into shadow, so no longer any annoying shadows on here. The horizon's starting to creep up the volcano, and that's when I started shooting a panorama, because this felt too tight. And I wanted to see more of the Milky Way, so I shot right, left, up to the left, back, top to the right, and got this 2x2 grid of shots of that composition that I could then merge back together later to get the wider view that I wanted. And so that shows that moonlit scene, which I could take further if I wanted to mess with that a little bit later, and I can adjust the contrast and the noise levels more, but that shows the general composition I was after. So once the moon set, then we get a lot better detail in the sky. It's not washed out. I'm still shooting those 2x2 panorama shots, but at the same time, I'm also running off to the side with the light and illuminating some of these lava rocks just to see what they look like. And so when you're standing there with your camera, if your camera's right here, you don't want to be lighting stuff up from behind it. It's going to look really flat. You have to get off to the side and get some side illumination, because then what that helps you with is it puts little shadows into things so you kind of get some shape. Yes?
What are those lights right at the base of the cinder cone?
I was interested in that too. So there's a home there. There's a couple of hogans over there. So this is state trust land, but like about 500 feet that way is private land, and so there's some homes down there. And then
They're having a star party too.
I know, that'd be a perfect spot. Yeah, as long as you don't want to see to the south. But so after doing that, so I adjust contrast when I'm processing it to get more detail in the sky. When that happens, it also really adds contrast to this area, which I'm not sure that I liked. So I brightened that area back up a little bit to make it feel less stark. But at the same time, I had captured some other light painted shots that I wanted to kind of rotate through. And this one I thought, okay, that captures the rock formation a lot better. And then I had another one, well, that kind of put some really cool highlights at the top. So what I did is I blended those two together to create the illuminated foreground that I wanted. And so I kind of stored that away as something I wanted to play with a little bit more. But I wanted to demonstrate few other things, and one of them was this silhouetted option. So I think there's a lot that I like about this, because this obviously feels very natural. This is the scene without any light going on, except for the star party at the base of Merriam and the sky. So that's one way to treat that composition.
Say, Jeremy?
Yeah.
Will your software allow you to zip those out of there?
Yeah. Yeah, I thought about it, and I was like, I wonder if I just want to, because if it's something that's really tiny, like if there's a power line that's running across the top, or like a plane that's going through, I don't feel bad about pulling those out. And I thought, well, maybe do I want to take those guys out of there? But I thought, that's kind of cool. I like the fact that there's like this little home at the base of Merriam, and maybe they'll be selling that place at some point. That'd be pretty cool. I think that'd be an awesome spot to have. But so I thought I kind of added just this little bit of interest to the shot, so I kept it in.
You're not on the reservation at that point?
No, yeah, the reservation's still another couple miles off to the,
Is there a crater inside there?
yeah, it's got, it's just this perfect bowl crater inside of that cone, just amazing. Even a caldera. This thing over here is like a big blocky caldera. They got a weird name for it, but I can't remember at the moment. But it's just such a fascinating place, the volcanic field we have around here. So this is like going back to that moonlit shot earlier. Could I take this and composite it with my darker Milky Way? What would that look like? So, like alien landscapes. So this is wild, right? But it's also very, very, it totally feels unreal. And the reason is, one of the reasons is, I didn't do a great job of masking it, but the other one is, it's just when you go out to a site at night, the horizon's darker than the sky. You shouldn't have the horizon being close to or brighter than the sky, otherwise it's going to feel very unnatural. So anytime you're blending vastly different exposures or vastly different light sources, you have to be thinking about that. So I darkened it up a little bit. So, does that help it? Does that kind of get it there? And I'm not sure. I think part of the trouble I have with this is that the moon is basically this way, heading, shining directly and everything. And it flattens it out. It doesn't feel doesn't feel like there's a lot of depth there. But you still try to help it out. You can try to do things like brighten the sky up just a little bit to add that more realistic contrast between sky and foreground. But anyway, that was a test. I didn't really care for it too much, but I wanted to show one of the things you could consider. Another one is twilight. So about an hour later, as we're getting into nautical twilight, I was exposing the foreground again and thought, well, what would happen if we composited that kind of illumination? So again, wild. And this is why they call that the blue hour, right? So not only do we have contrast weirdness, but also color strangeness going on. So first thing we'd want to do is we'd want to warm that up, get that back to a natural color. Still too bright though, so we'd want to darken it. And that helps. I love the texture here. That twilight illumination from this side is really providing some detail in those rocks. But it needs to be darker. And at this point, I'm thinking this is something I could potentially like. So I'm kind of storing away in my mind, this is more of an illumination that I'm interested in. And then maybe brighten the horizon up again a little bit more, just to help with that realism of that composite. So here's the other one, is using Starlight. So this is about a 4-minute exposure. All that landscape is now lit by stars. And it's a very soft glow, very natural feeling. And I really like that too. So we put it back in here. So again, unnatural to start with. We got to darken it up and maybe even darken it some more. Once we get it down here, this I like even more than that previous one, because this feels a lot more natural. We've got starlight above, we've got starlight lighting the foreground, the contrast isn't so wild, the color is unnatural. And then how about if I just pop in some of that light painting? So this led to the one that I decided this was my favorite of that set. But one other thing you can do, and you'll see a lot of ways people process the sky in their images. This processes it so we're pretty close to neutral in the non-Milky Way dark areas of the sky, but that can there's some variability in your choices. So I added just a little bit of blue to that background, and I felt that kind of helped to complement or contrast with the foreground. And so that's where I wound up with that one.
So how long does this take to do all this tweaking? You've got a lot of patience.
Yeah, so like, and the funny thing is when I think about real deep sky astrophotography that people do, that gives me a headache just thinking about it. So it's not as tedious, but still, like doing this might be a couple hours worth of work, kind of sifting through stuff. And
It's not bad.
it's not, so it's because it's the level that I'm taking it. I'm not using flat fields. I'm not using dark frames and a lot of other stuff. I'm kind of not going that far with it. But looking at all the options I did, that took longer. I mean, if I was just going down one of those paths, that helps. Let's see, where was I at? Oh, hang on, let me just go back. So what I want to do is I'm gonna stop there. If you have any questions, I can't remember exactly when I started. I think we may be closing in on 55 minutes here. I don't know. So if you have any questions, let me know.
We don't get thrown out of here.
No, we don't. Get the cane, pull me off.
Did you get up to the crater, to look down in the crater?
I have not. I would. There is a road I saw that goes up on the south side of that you can get to the top of that crater. but I don't think my vehicle would do well with it, so I'd have to involve a hike. Pretty cool though.
Is that up near Grand Falls?
Yes, actually it is. I'm not sure exactly how far, but it is in that direction.
Grand Falls.
I think Grand Falls is a little bit more like off that way, but yeah.
Over there.
When you have your star image and you want to blend it in with the foreground, is that like using layers in Photoshop?
It is, and in fact, after it, because I brought something along on the laptop that I can kind of show you how those layers are structured if anybody's interested. But yes, I'll stack up layers. Maybe I'll set up a whole stack of layers for my star field if I'm like trying to stack those and get the noise out. Then I'll put another layer on top of that with maybe one of those star fields has a foreground that I like. I'll duplicate that back above, and then I'll mask that in because when you stack that star field, your foreground's going to get all hazy because it's derotated, and so you've got to kind of do some masking in there with those layers to make that happen. So I'm happy to show you after a little bit of that too. You had a question.
If we were to do it on a white and cold night, would it change?
Like
Summer versus winter.
Yeah, it does. So all night long, that first of all night long that Milky Way is rotating with the sky, and so that view is always different all night long. So anytime you look there, hour by hour, you're going to see a different part of the sky. But then also month by month, if you go out there just before sunrise one month, the next month you're going to see a different part of the sky rising up above. So it does change. Good question. Yes.
On the meteorite shower, we had 8 or 10 streaks. How long exposure is that?
Oh, I'm glad you asked that, because I meant to say something about that. So with meteor shower shots, so like with these kind of images, I'll be exposing as long as I can get away with. If it's 15 seconds, 20 seconds, I'll be doing that. But with meteor shower shots, that meteor is not lingering. It's moving, whereas the stars get the advantage of hanging out in one spot. The meteor is moving, so it's going to leave, if you leave that exposure on too long, that star and that sky are going to brighten up and overpower the meteor, so we have to shorten them. So I might do maybe 8 seconds or something like that on those, just so the meteor has more impact versus the sky. Yeah, Brent.
So how do you what function do you use to define the landscape edge? I mean, what do you do in Photoshop, or I mean, what tells it? Do you just look for a big brightness difference?
So a couple things. It's kind of I'll try to start off with an automated process. Well, in Photoshop, this exists in red, green, and blue channels. So red, green, blue is what makes up the color in the image. And it turns out that the blue side typically tends to have the biggest contrast between sky and landscape. So I'll go into that blue channel and I'll adjust the contrast until I can get the sky as white as possible and the landscape as dark as possible, and then kind of like paint in any of the stuff that it missed. So I get a perfectly white sky, perfectly black foreground, and I start there. Now, the thing is, then I'll use that as my mask, so that way it'll hide. Like if I want to show the foreground, I'll invert that so that the foreground's white in the mask. And this is all kind of weird gibberish, I know, but it's like that provides the detail for where it's going to show land and sky. But then you have to preview the image, and a lot of times still, because that definition between land and sky is going to have some softness in areas, now you have to kind of blur it just a little bit. Add some blur, maybe then get in with either the paintbrush or any of the different tools that are burn and dodge to kind of change the shape of that, just so that you don't see a weird demarcation between land and sky. So that's where the finessing and a lot of the time consuming comes in.
Like a hard edge.
Yes, yeah. And that's where you'll also notice that there's a big difference. Like if you've got that weird moonlit foreground and it's super bright, that's where it's a lot harder to get a realistic definition. That's why you don't want a huge amount of brightness contrast between them, not just because it's natural, but also because just it's difficult to control a realistic boundary between them.
Hey, Jeremy. Are folks using processes like this to earn our MFA, Master in Fine Arts?
Well, I don't know.
It's like you already got it mastered.
Wait, well, it's just like, I don't know how many hours you're supposed to do something before you become, I don't know, but I'm learning something new every time that I do this, or I'm getting frustrated to death with something new. But that's that process of iterating through it and doing it over and over again.
Right.
that some of it becomes more natural until you find the next hurdle to jump.
So are we gonna see some of these images in Arizona highways?
You know, I've been thinking about like, because to do that, you can't just say, hey, here's an image. You have to put a story together for them, I think. And you have to take the time to really craft something interesting and with a unique hook to it, you know. So I'm thinking about that, but maybe I'll try that at some point. And I'm gonna come to you, Liz, you had a comment back
Yeah,
there.
what was the app you used earlier?
Oh, on the phone? The phone app that I use to find things, and see, that's called Photopills. So P-I-L-L-S, Photopills. And that, yeah, if you look that up on the App Store, that's the one I used for that. There's another one called Plan It, P-L-A-N-I-T exclamation point, that also does it. I think Plan It is a little more complex looking. I love the way Photopills is a little more easy to work with, though. And
Malcolm Gladwell has written several books, and one, I can't remember the title of it, but he said to be really expert, and he's done this research, it takes like 10,000 man hours.
that's what it was, yeah.
And there's like 2,000 man hours in a year, so if you're an athlete, concert, pianist, whatever, that's how much work it takes.
Yeah, definitely. And I can see you, and then you, I see, yeah.
On your desert shots with cacti and bushes and whatnot, right in the immediate foreground is really lit up, and just behind that, it starts getting dark. It doesn't seem possible that to be from the sun, and the way on it, there's no dark.
Yeah.
How do you do that?
So, like, if it was, it kind of depends, like, some of it is, when you're illuminating with this light, you're gonna have a very focused area that's gonna be lit up, and then everything else is gonna be dark and look kind of out of, so that's kind of what's happening here is, you know, the foreground's
Not
really.
natural.
Yeah, so this, yeah, so some of those are gonna be lit by this, yes, yeah, so that's where the light painting side of it comes in.
I just wanted to expand a little bit. You mentioned GIMP. We wanted to let people know that the nice thing about that, as opposed to Photoshop, is it's free. So it's
Yes.
a little less upfront investment for tinkering.
Absolutely. Yeah, thanks for mentioning that too. Yeah, I think that's why I remembered it from the past, is just, you don't have to get into like a subscription with Photoshop to have to do this and kind of get into GIMP. They've got great videos and tutorials to kind of show you how to learn it, and you can start for free.
again?
GIMP, G-I-M-P. Yeah.
Jeremy, you've never used a spectrally modified DSLR, have you?
I have not. I've been fascinated to try that, but no, I haven't. There's somebody, you mentioning that reminds me, I wanted to talk about something. So Stan Honda is a photographer, and he does astrophotography. He's been using a camera that's been modified, so he's able to capture infrared with it, and it's like really interesting to see what he gets with these nightscape shots. But I want to mention too, he's going to be out here, by the way, September 28th for the Festival of Science. He will be doing a nightscape photography workshop where he covers some of the details here, but, I mean, obviously his own stuff, clearly. But also then he gives you an opportunity to go out and shoot out at Buffalo Park and practice what you learned. So if anybody wants to do that, keep in mind Festival of Science, September 28th.
The Flagstaff Star Party is
Yep.
part of that.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, so I'd love to try that at some point though, just to see what else can get captured. Okay. Well, thank you very much.
Very good.
I like the picture you got of me in there.
Everybody aimed and pointed in the right direction. Perfect.